So as we are sighting deeper and deeper into a militarized police state, let's talk about the imperial boomerang and how the tactics, techniques, technologies, and procedures used to enforce occupation and apartheid in Palestine are coming for us all.
Trust nothing. No laws. Free your mind. Everything is propaganda. Everything. Propaganda. Everything is propaganda. So why not choose your own?
The imperial boomerang, or Foucault's boomerang, is the thesis that governments that develop repressive techniques to control colonial territories will eventually deploy those same techniques domestically against their own citizens. So, the same systems of colonial coercion will, through imperial feedback, be used on the empire's own citizens. If you essentially field test some forms of control overseas and they work, why wouldn't the ruling class deploy them on their own unruly citizens? So let's give some examples by talking about cops. How it all started, how they actually assert colonial control over us as Western citizens. Well, to begin, modern day police are a substitute for the age-old constable and watch system of protection. A constable was a public officer, usually of a town or township, responsible for keeping the peace and for minor judicial duties like executing warrants for a local justice of the peace. And watchmen were organized groups of men, usually authorized by a state, government, city, or society, to deter criminal activity and provide law enforcement, as well as traditionally perform the services of public safety, fire watch, crime prevention, crime detection, and the recovery of stolen goods. Watchmen have existed since the earliest recorded times in various guises throughout the world, and were generally succeeded by the emergence of formally organized professional policing. In the late 18th century, law enforcement and policing was left entirely to local initiative. If strikes and protests and perceived rises in crime became an issue, they'd call in the army, and that was always very messy. Officials began to contemplate an alternative to volunteer policing, but in England, they didn't want their police to be as militant as the French gendarmerie. The upper class and the rising middle class in Britain were too jealous of their perceived liberties for French militarism. So in 1829, the London Metropolitan Police was founded. It was supposed to be the middle ground between the militancy of the French gendarmerie and the constable and watch system that had no coercive force. But here's the tension. Even though the civic police was crafted as an alternative to martial law, it was nevertheless militarized from the outset. And the police borrowed less from the military per se, but more from colonial forms of control. Sir Robert Peel, who founded the London Metropolitan Police, had colonial experience, serving essentially as Northern Ireland's regional governor for a time, and developed forms of colonial coercion that he brought back to the London Met Police. He took forms of coercion from the Dublin Metropolitan Police, which was essentially an armed counterinsurgency force responsible for punishing crime, dealing with public disorder and uprisings. But just like any other colonial project, the line between crime and uprising is never clear. Was never clear. They're always bleeding together. A decade before the London Met Police, he founded the Royal Irish Constabulary, responsible for policing rural districts in Ireland. It was composed of army veterans, used military rank structure, and they carried carbines and were housed in barracks and patrolled pre-designated precincts. And well, he took that structure of colonial practice, you know, of a counterinsurgency force, and slapped it on his new London Metropolitan Police, which served as a model for the fledgling police in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. So this is just one example about how the police were militarized from the start, and one example of the sociological dynamics of the imperial boomerang. Other examples are about how modern police were also born out of slave patrols, another Anglo counterinsurgency force in the Caribbean and Carolinas. And so the most pressing and modern example of the imperial boomerang is how our cops go to Israel to train with the IDF, use Israeli technology, the same technology that is counterinsurgent in nature and used to enforce occupation and apartheid on Palestinians. And they come back to America to use those same forms of colonial coercion on American citizens. In addition to slave patrols, American policing has its roots in union busting, property protection, and scab defense, i.e. protecting non-union workers from striking workers. Cops have been on the wrong side of every labor struggle and have always moved to squash civil dissent on and off academic campuses. They were the main perpetrators of violence during the civil rights movement, the Vietnam backlash, South African apartheid, 2003 Iraq War, the BLM movement, and now the pro-Palestine movement. It's almost like they don't protect and serve the people, but instead the interests of the ruling and political elite. A big problem right now is surveillance. Elbit Systems, an Israeli defense contractor, is on the Texas-Mexico border, or has equipment on there, and will begin looking inward. There are already reservation lands under constant surveillance from Elbit equipment. When colonial forms of control feed back on the citizens of empire, it always begins with the most marginalized groups of people. Eventually, it will always work itself up the privilege ladder until everyone who dissents is labeled a, quote, enemy of the state. And the term enemy of the state is race, class, and gender neutral. Happy 2024.